I'm warning you now, they may hear things you don't want them to hear. All right? Right? Yes. Yes. Okay. You ready to go? Okay. Okay, we're going. All right. My name is Rick Smith, and usually I start off by giving a couple announcements about other things that are related to my lecture, only because they're important later on. One thing I want to bring to your attention, which relates to this lecture in a big way, is a friend of mine by the name of George Haas has written a new book. It came out towards the end of 2005. It's called the Cydonia Codex. It's in the syllabus, which is why a lot of things I'll mention are already listed in the syllabus. If it's not, I'll tell you. It's extremely important that you read a book like that because it deals with the direct connection between what's referred to as the geoglyphs on Mars and the geoglyphs and cultural icons of Mesoamerica, that being South America, Mayan, Incan, and Aztec, and Olmec. The connection being that what he refers to as Olmecs, he identified with me as what I was referring to as the Moorish legacy. Okay? The Cydonia Codex is a big key to understanding the relationship between Mars and Earth. Both he and I had agreed that one of the biggest reasons that NASA keeps burying this stuff, that there's hundreds of geoglyphs out there. I'm sure you've heard of Richard Hoagland, but what he had done would be seen as juvenile compared to what George Haas and William Saunders have done with the Cydonia Codex. It's 10 years worth of research. And it goes far above or beyond what now would be just juvenile shenanigans with what's referred to as the face on Mars. The stuff they get into relates to the people of color and hue here on Earth, the Mesoamerican cultures of South America, who of course came from the Olmecs of Africa. And he and I were talking, and one of those geoglyphs is the image of a primate with negroid-like features and the headdress of an Egyptian. And there's no way in hell that white NASA is going to let that get out to the general mainstream public because you'd be admitting too much, okay? That just gives you a real, just a glimpse at what we're going to get into. About myself, I was just talking to someone over here, but I'll just go over a few things. The way we'll do the lecture here is that I'll give a brief introduction to myself. Overview of experiences, what brought us to this understanding, mentors and inspirations, and the missing piece. Then I'll explain how the lecture is structured. We'll get through that in hopefully about 15 minutes because there is a limited amount of time to this tonight, and it's kind of like 5 hours of information packed into 2 hours, all right? My first awakening came at the age of 21, and in that awakening, I was shown everything that had happened before, from childhood on up to the age of 21, and everything that would be happening with me into the near future, okay? During that time, what was happening was, now I can say this, I'm 36 years old, I have some basis to go from. I've looked back over time and realized that there's been a pattern every 10 years on the 11th year, and what I mean by that is that there wasn't just something that took place at the age of 21. 10 years before that, at the age of 11, there was also something else that took place. My mother and I together, viewing this from the perspective of being a generational phenomena, my mother and I both witnessed our very first bona fide UFO experience. Then at the age of 21, I have this extraterrestrial awakening. The significance of that is that at that point, the entity that I refer to in my book as Mother, and I also refer to her as the crone, had came to me, and at that point in time, it just so happens to coincide with the fact that I was deciding to go back to school at SUNY Old Westbury to refocus my efforts more so on fine art instead of commercial art, and that's where I ended up finding myself, but in finding myself, people don't seem to realize when I say that there's a lot more behind that. In finding myself, it coincides with the extraterrestrial experience, with the crone coming and explaining a few things to me about what had been going on, not only with me, but with my family in general. And this is when it was made aware to me that this not only it wasn't just about me, although it was culminating with me. It had to do with my mother and my grandmother, and maybe even back further than that, and this is how it becomes a generational thing in my family. Some people have asked, in reference to the feminine goddess energy, why would it be passed on to a man if the tradition was grandmother to mother, shouldn't have been to daughter? There were no girls in my family. My whole generation of kids were all boys. But as we go along in this lecture, I think you realize why the mantle of responsibility was passed on to a white Caucasian male who has a lot more power with his voice than anybody else because of the racist mentality of the issues we're dealing with, okay? And the pattern continued. In the introduction of my book, I actually talk about the most recent part of that pattern or cycle came yet another 10 years after age of 21 at 31. So you figure 11, 21, 31. At the age of 31, I was going through a very difficult trial and tribulation in my life personally, okay? And it had to do with someone else who was also equally involved with this with me. Someone I refer to in the book as Ella Mermaid. There were issues going on there at the time that was almost like baptism by fire, okay? And by the time the year 2001 came along, she had to go her way, I had to go mine. There were two different things taking place there, and we couldn't stay together anymore. That brought about a different kind of an awakening, and it's around this it's around this time that I end up having another extraterrestrial experience where an entity associated with the crone ends up coming to me and says, you know, grabs me by the arm and says, "What the hell are you waiting for? Get going," okay? It's from my early 30s on, in the last 6 years, that my focus on the paranormal, where I was in my 20s, you know, was one thing. Where I am now in my 30s is much different. In fact, what I talk about now, I never would have understood really 10 years ago. I probably would have gotten it, but never would have understood the significance. Here I am now at the age of 36, and what has culminated over the last 5 years since the age of 31 is that I've gone in a direction that has a much more solid foundation to it. And what I mean by that is that the abduction phenomena by itself, Freemasonry by itself, doesn't work. And this is why you get these asshole white academics who get away with saying, oh, that doesn't exist. Well, that's funny, because if I ask members who represent the other 70% of the population, that people of color and you, also known as the sun-kissed people of Earth, I seem to get a different answer. Okay, so you got 70% of the planet, blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asians, okay? Anyone who's 7 shades darker than me, giving me one answer, and you've got this other elite 30%, Caucasian pale skin, saying something completely different, going against the grain of truth that represents the majority. So I was getting to a certain point where about 2 years ago, Peter Moon and I hooked up again. I'd known Peter Moon since 1994. But around 2004, we had hooked up again, and he knew intuitively where I was going. As a matter of fact, he turns out to be one of my mentors. He ends up walking out to me at one of his meetings, hands me this giant book. It's about yay thick and square like this, okay? It's in the syllabus. I do recommend you take the time to study it. I'm about 1/3 of the way through it, and I'm still reading it because it's got little tiny type like this going down every page. But he sends it to me, and I look at it, and it says, the biography of Noble Drew Ali. He says, I know about this. He says, I've been involved in getting to know the Moorish legacy. He says, but I have not read this. He says, this is for you. And he just gives it to me. I said, well, what do you want for it? I mean, the book is about $100.